Okay, hi, I'm Father Michael Barrett, and this is a class, a simple class, short class on medical ethics. And the reason why medical ethics is so important today is that all of us are in situations where we have close relatives, not just because of the COVID virus, but close relatives who are older than we are that we have to make decisions about when they're in medical care. And we have to decide what kind of things we can and must or must not do in order to help them. As I put here, it is I who deal death and give life, which is from Deuteronomy, which we just used as the responsorial psalm on Tuesday of this week. It is I who deal death and give life. It's important to understand that we do not have control over life or death. It's God's decision, like it or not. We had no clue when we would be born, but God made the decision with our parents cooperating, and our death comes when God is ready. And sometimes we don't expect it at all at the time, but when He decides, that's when we go to Him for eternal life. And then looking at life, we human beings possess life because we have received it as a gift from God. So the possession of life is something that comes from God. It has its own dignity in and of itself, regardless of what people would say is the quality of life or how well we live it or we don't live it. In and of itself, life is important. That's why I think sometimes when you see poor people who are homeless and maybe they're drunk and they're not all there on the sidewalk, they have dignity because they have life, human life given to them by God. Sometimes people can look down on those people, kind of shock. What kind of experience have they had in warfare? What kind of things have happened in their families that led them into depression and so on? But they have dignity because they're human beings made by God. I think it's important to remember that because it helps us sometimes in the decisions we have to make in our families, in situations that we're in. One of the things that also happens that I think people today avoid a great deal is death. People don't want to talk about death. I think that's one of the reasons why everybody tries to look so young as much as they can, and why we have a world that has no silence because people don't want to think about anything. And one of the ones you think about is death. Physical death is certain. It's not just for some of us or most of us, it's for all of us. Death is permanent cessation, which is good to have this notion in mind. Permanent cessation of all vital functions. That's death. Now, how do we determine what death is? That comes down to science and medicine. Morally, we can't say when death takes place. The Catholic Church or any other institution cannot say when death takes place. It's determined by scientists when it's permanent and all vital functions cease. Good for us to keep that in mind. Sometimes people think, well, we have to know when the moment of death comes. We will never know that, frankly. We will never know exactly when the moment of death comes. For now, the way people consider death is fundamentally brain death. Now, why is it brain death? Well, I'll be honest, it's because if you look at it, it's a pretty good measure, though it's not perfect. And there are people who say brain death does not really truly indicate death. There's no other way right now that's better. The Catholic Church does say brain death means death, and that's what we use as a guide. Is that absolute? Not yet, because biologically it's not absolute, so morally we can't make a pure determination about it. Brain death is a term used to indicate that one has been determined to be dead using neurological criteria, which is the flat line. That on the machine they check you and it's a flat line. You you know your brain no longer functions. And that means the rest of your body, if it's not dead, it's on its way. But again, brain death is something that the scientists determine. They may come up with a better conclusion as we go down the line. And when they do, that'll be great. Then we can look at it from a moral perspective. Terminal illness is what we're looking at for most of us. It's one way or the other. Terminal illness is when we know that the person has an irreversible deterioration in their health condition. We know that they're just going to get sicker and sicker till they die. You could say, in a way, we're all terminally ill. Everybody grows old, you're terminally ill. Nobody grows younger, you grow older. So life is particularly difficult for a person who's really, truly terminally ill because they have cancer or they have some situation of a deterioration of some organ in their body that can't be reversed, then we know they're terminally ill. And we may be able to say they probably have 5 months, 6 months, 3 months left to live. Then there's a degenerative disorder besides terminal illness. These are terms I just throw out. Degenerative disorder, which is somebody who has a sickness that is affecting the structure and function of their body. Probably we all have it because we all age and become wrinkled and so on and so forth. But other people have things like Parkinson's or Alzheimer's disease, multiple sclerosis, muscular dystrophies, where they're degenerating. And it's just going to continue on, and it's not going to be reversed, at least not yet in a lot of these. It's progressive. And then we have vegetative state. And this is probably a little more difficult to understand. In a vegetative state, the patient's basic body functions, such as breathing, heartbeat, and body temperature, are maintained. Not completely, because they do need some way to support them while they're in the vegetative state. But they're alive, they will continue to be alive. They do need nutrition, hydration, they need shelter, and they need warmth. Those things we all need, everybody needs. If you're asleep, you need those things. But in the vegetative state, you're going to need that for a long time. Some people pull out of vegetative state. A lot of times it lasts for a very long time. We don't know. We're not sure when it's over. So it's important to emphasize that the term vegetative is used only to describe a clinical state. It doesn't mean anything completely, but it is a clinical state. Some people, even in the vegetative state, various kinds of illnesses, they still hear, they still feel, they're still aware of what's going on around them. I won't go through some of the other things like this because these accomplish the main things that we would want to look at. Different areas of things that we bump into. These are where you see articles in the newspaper where people are in a terrible shape and then they survive. It's and others are in it for a very long time and sometimes eventually they pass away. But in some of these areas, what we bump into is euthanasia, which is now becoming something that's very important in American society. Euthanasia was 10, 20 years ago, it wasn't that crucial, but it's becoming very much so. In fact, some of the states in the United States allow you to commit euthanasia yourself, to take enough pills to kill yourself. So the life of an innocent person is destroyed in euthanasia. And that's why it's murder, to put it in a simple way. And sometimes life of an innocent person is destroyed. And sometimes the person wants that. So they agree with undergoing euthanasia, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's forced on them. And so it's always gravely wrong. Either you want it or you don't want it, it's always gravely wrong. What does a dignified death mean? Because sometimes people think that euthanasia brings about a dignified death. The reason why they think so is that euthanasia takes people away from pain and suffering and loneliness by how? Killing the person. Instead of addressing the disease, it's killing the person. That's the solution, is kill the innocent person. But a dignified death is one that recognizes, which we touched on already, that man is a creature who comes from God at the beginning of his existence and returns to him at his end. It is I who deal death and give life. It allows him to die, so far as possible, in possession of his faculties, surrounded by those who love him, and comforted and aided by the spiritual and sacramental gifts of his faith. Okay, so rather than falling into euthanasia is to help the person who's sick rather than killing the person. Usually people who are in great pain, there's an area of medicine called palliative area of medicine. And what it does is it prepares people who know they're going to die. This is where we hear the thing of a hospice. They know they're going to die. What they need is painkillers. They need comfort. They need other people. Now, some people say, well, I don't have other people. I live alone. I have no family. So I want to just commit euthanasia. I want to die. Kill me or I will commit euthanasia. But palliative care is to release them of some of these burdens that they have as they're dying. It's a very important part of medicine that has only come to be more important in the last couple of decades, really. It's still developing. So what we have to see is then in these situations when people are not dying, but they're suffering, then we have to look at how do we give them the right means to conquer the disease. Now, some of the things, palliative care is a person who's going to die. Usually in a hospice, it's 6 months that they go into palliative care. Most people who are sick, they need other things. What do we use to help people who are sick? This is where we get into the notion of an ordinary and extraordinary means. Ordinary and extraordinary means. Sometimes they cross over. Sometimes it's a difficult situation where they are. And I'll say this because I will say that when we're talking about ordinary and extraordinary care instead of just palliative care, it's very hard to determine. I will say that as one can see, one can appreciate from a lot of given definitions about what's ordinary, what's extraordinary, there's no precise dividing line for categorizing one method as ethically ordinary and another as ethically extraordinary. So, a thing that is ordinary, a person has a moral obligation to use ordinary or proportionate means. So you have to use ordinary means of preserving his or her life. Proportionate means are those that in the judgment of the patient offer a reasonable hope of the patient of benefit and do not entail an excessive burden or impose excessive expense on the family or the community. Again, I know it's not precise. I'd say in these situations where people are struggling with illnesses that are serious and we're trying to decide what we can use and we don't use, it's very important to listen to the doctors and find out what's happening. But it's also good to have somebody in the picture who understands ethics, a priest or someone who's going to be able to help us. A person can forego extraordinary means. They don't have to use extraordinary means. Again, it's difficult. Here's an example. A mechanical respirator is used for a young person who's suffering from transitory paralysis of the respiratory muscles would be an ethically proportionate method of preserving his life. At the same time, the very same respirator would be an ethically disproportionate method for a patient with rampant lung cancer that has totally overridden the lungs and spread throughout the body. Okay, so it's the same thing, the same means, but it's different of being ordinary or extraordinary because of the circumstances. Very hard. Using the respirator for that person has no benefit, and therefore it's not necessary to use. I think sometimes doctors don't want to admit that they fail. I've had it in my own situation to see my mother with my father, and he's dead. And the doctors come in and they want to jump on top of him for code blue and try to save his life. Well, he's 80 years of age. He's got emphysema. He already had indicated do not resuscitate, but the doctors were still going to do it. Well, eventually my mother just said to them, no, he's gone, period. Could they do it? Yeah, they could. What would it mean? Yeah, he'd live for another week on a machine. And that's not really ordinary under the circumstances. What's involved in some of these things always is suffering, which I'm sort of jumping ahead here because we're going to run out of time. And some people think that if you suffer, then that somehow changes the situation. But it doesn't. Everybody suffers. The notion of suffering is to realize that because everybody suffers, it's something that you can deal with as part of your life, as part of who you are, as part of what makes you. It even changes your personality. I tell you, I've been through it myself where they told me I was going to die. And after going through an awful lot of difficulties to survive, when I talk to people now about death or suffering, the way I approach them as a priest is totally different than before, because I've been there, done that, saw it, felt it. And I can help those people in a different way than before because of the suffering. Plus, as a Catholic, suffering sometimes is God's plan of preparing us for the end of our life. You could say it's a kind of a purgatory that God has in store for us to prepare for the end of our life. So instead of dying and going to purgatory, maybe our purgatory is here through the suffering and then we die. And maybe not at that moment. But it means that we have to accept death. And some people don't want to accept death. I'm going to kind of go to an area that's important. But I'd say this whole thing of using ordinary and extraordinary means, when you're in that situation as a person, get people to help you to figure it out. It's hard to figure it out all by yourself. You have to, as I say, you have to have a good doctor who understands it. That doesn't mean he's Catholic, but he understands it. Or as well, a priest or someone else who can guide you in how to figure it out under these circumstances. But the other thing is hydration and nutrition. What does that mean? It means that when you're dealing with a person, however sick they are, whatever vegetative state they are, whether they're terminal or they're not terminal, you go down the whole line, they always need hydration. That is, they need to drink. If they can't drink, they put it into them through an intravenous fluid, but they have to have that in them. And nutrition, that they eat. They always have to eat. Maybe they can't feed themselves, but they have a feeding tube. And people always need hydration and nutrition. The rare exception when they don't, in either case, is because you give them nutrition, but they can't handle the food coming into them because they're too far gone. Or the hydration doesn't help them. In fact, it hurts them. If they have tumors, you give them hydration. Sometimes it causes the tumors to expand. And as a result, it causes more pain. And it isn't going to help the patient who has the hydration. Even though, under all of the circumstances, hydration hydration and nutrition, which is drinking and eating, are always required. Always. Because if you take it away, without hydration, they die of thirst. And without nutrition, they die of starvation. And in a lot of cases, that death is miserable. We don't always understand it because we're on the outside looking in and the person is vegetative or whatever. But they go through a heck of a terrible time in the process. And that's one of the areas of medical ethics that we have to learn how to deal with on a regular basis. How to make hydration and nutrition always there. Anyway, these are ideas that I just share in a very quick way because we don't have much time. But there are things that we can talk about more down the road. One of the things in all of this is that we need a living will before we close. That means that every single person should have a will that indicates what they want when they get sick. And usually the best thing is to have a health proxy or a, what's the word? All of a sudden I drew blank. It is it's where you give the power to somebody else. Power of attorney. Power of attorney to a particular person, a person that you trust. Why do I say this? Because with these two, you control who's going to make the decision for you when you're unconscious and you can't think. A living will in general can also be put in the hands of the hospital, which means you're going to have somebody else make the decision, probably doctors. I have doctors in my family, nurses in my family. I have great respect. They've saved my life many times. But I don't want my living will to be in the hands of doctors. I want them to be in the hands of people that I know and love, know what I think. So you go health proxy, or best is power of attorney, naming a person or maybe two persons if one's not available to make the decisions about the ordinary or the extraordinary means, how far we're going to go, what are the circumstances that we're in. I think these things are very useful to look into yourself. You go into a hospital nowadays, and usually they want you to do something like this when you enter the hospital in the first place. But just remember, these two, especially this, are the most important way to do it. Those are some ideas of medical ethics, very quick. There's a lot more, but at least I think it gives you some things to think about and realize that we have to study more about how to handle people in difficult medical situations. Thank you.